Hello everyone, welcome to video number 3 of AP Computer Science A. In this video, you're going to learn about arrays and array lists of objects. But before we do that, let's first learn about for each loops. For each loops can be used to iterate through collections, such as arrays or array lists. So let's first initialize an array of ints. All right, and then the syntax for a for each loop is for parentheses, the variable type of the collection you're trying to iterate through. In this case, it's int, and then the name of a variable, colon, and then the name of the collection, which in this case is list. So what a for each loop does is it sets a to each element of the collection in turn. So it would first set a to 5, and then 2, and then 6, and then 4, and then 5. So let's just print out a with each iteration of this for each loop. So it should print out 5, 2, 6, 4, and 5. And indeed it does. So for each loops can be used to iterate through a collection more easily than regular for loops. And keep in mind that for each loops can only be used to access elements of a collection. They cannot be used to modify because A is constantly set to the element at the current index instead of the current index. And in order to modify a collection, you need to know the current index and not the element at the current index. So now that we've learned about for each loops, let's create a class. And I'm going to call this class athletes. All right, so some variables that we would need are the name. So in previous videos, we didn't need the names of people because when we're creating just a single object, you can give that object a name. But when we're creating an array or array list of objects, you cannot give each individual object a name. So that's why I'm going to put name as one of the variables. And then another variable that I'll put is the number of the athlete on the team. Okay, so let's go ahead and make the constructor. And since I made both variables private variables, let's make the setter and getter for each. All right, so now we've created this athletes class. So now let's create an array of athletes. So the way you would do that is you would use the initialization that you would normally use for an array, except instead of putting a variable type such as int, you would put the name of the class. So we would initialize it by writing athletes list equals new athletes, and then the length. So I'll just make it 3. All right, and then now currently all elements of this list are set to void, null. That means that you cannot use them. So let's go ahead and modify each element of this array so that it's not null. And you would do that using the constructor. I'm going to create 3 athletes. The first one is going to be named Jack and have the number 27. And the second element, his name is going to be Andy, and the number will be 4. And then the third athlete, have the name James, and number 8. So now we've created an array of athletes. And if you want to modify, access, or use a method on any of the objects, the phrase you would use is the name of the collection and then the index. So suppose that you made a mistake and the first athlete was actually supposed to have a number of 1. In this case, you could do list 0.set number and then 1. All right, but let's not do this. So let's actually just use a for each loop to iterate through each element and print out the name and the number. So the initialization would be for athletes, because that's the name of the class. Name of a variable, let's call it x, colon, the name of the collection. All right, and then inside we need to write system.out.println x dot name, then let's put a space after that, and then x dot get number. All right, so let's run this and see what it does. All right, it prints out what it was supposed to print. So now let's actually use another for each loop before this. So I'm going to make it iterate through this list again. I'm going to do x dot set number to 1. All right, you might think that this wouldn't do anything because, like I said, you cannot modify a collection using a for each loop. But let's run this and see what it prints out this time. It prints out 1 for each of the numbers. So you actually modified the collection with this for each loop. Why? Well, collections of primitive variable types such as int, char, string, boolean, they cannot be modified using a for each loop. However, a collection of objects can. A simple explanation for why this is the case is, if you remember back from video 9 of Java Fundamentals where you learned about methods, you learned that you can modify an array using a method. And an array is basically an object. So a similar thing would happen for an array list of objects, or sorry, an array of objects. You can modify it using for each loops. The more detailed explanation why it has to do with pointers, which you learned about in video 8 of Java Fundamentals. So basically what this for each loop would do is it would make x point to what the current element of the array is pointing to. And since they're pointing to the same thing, if you change x, you will also change the current element of the array. And this might have been confusing, but don't worry. The most important thing that you should remember is that you can modify an array of objects using a for each loop, and you can modify objects using methods. So now let's change this up. So let's change it to an array list of athletes. So remember that we first need to import it. All right, and then let's change up the code. So the way you would initialize an array list is the same as you would initialize an array list of primitive variable types, except the variable type would just be the name of the class. And I'm actually going to let the user decide what each element of this array list is. So let's initialize a scanner. And then let's first take a number. So that's the number of athletes there will be. And then let's use a for loop. So this for loop will run num times, and then each time we want to add something to the list. So we will add a new athlete, and then we will let the user decide what the name and the number is. All right, so let's run this. I'm just going to give an input. It's not going to give anything as output, but I just want to demonstrate. All right, so now we have an array list of 2 athletes. The first has the name Peter and the number 21. The second has the name Lucas and the number 9. So if you want to modify, access, or use a method on any object of an array list, the phrase you would use is the collection name dot get and then the index. So let's suppose that after we let the user decide what each element is, we decide that we shouldn't let the user decide the numbers, and then instead we just want to set the number for the first athlete to 1, the number for the second to 2, and so on. In that case, we would use a for loop to iterate through each element of this array list. And then inside we would say list.get a, and then set name, or sorry, the number to a plus 1. All right, and then let's use a for each loop to print out each element of this array list. Right, so let's run this. And I'll give the same input that I gave last time. All right, so now it prints this, which is the correct output. The optional exercise for this video has 2 parts. Part A is to create the students class, which has the public variables name, which is a string, age, which is an int, and GPA, which is a double. Then create an array of students in the main class and take an int num from the user, followed by the information for the array. So the input that you're taking is basically the same as the example that I showed earlier for the array list. So if you want to give this a try, then pause the video here and keep watching for the solution. So here is the solution. First, we create the students class. And we need the variables name, age, and GPA. And the constructor would be public students, and then 3 parameters, a string, an int, and a double. And then we just set each variable to the corresponding parameter. And then to create the array, we first need to import the scanner, then initialize it. And then we take in an input num. And to initialize the array, we do students, brackets, the name, I'll just call it list, equals new students, and then of length num. All right, and then we do a for loop for a equals 0, a is less than num, a plus plus. We say element a of list equals new students dot next in dot next int in dot next double. All right, so this is it for part A. Here's part B of the exercise. create the print by age method in the students class, which takes the array of students as a parameter and prints each student name after the correct age. The order of the ages and the names within each age doesn't matter. So this might be confusing, but just look at the sample input and the sample output and it will instantly make sense. And this is a pretty challenging exercise. So here's a hint. You need to create two array lists in the method, one that keeps track of the ages and one that keeps track of the students with the corresponding age. But even if you're unable to solve this exercise with the hint, that's fine. But if you want to give this a try, then pause the video here. Here is the solution. So first we need to make sure that array lists are imported in the student class. And now let's make the method. So first I'm going to make the two array lists that we need. Alright, so I made the second array list of type string, and you'll see why in a moment. So now we need to iterate through each element of our list, so we can use a for each loop. So there are two cases to consider. One is if ages already contains the age of the current student, and one is if it doesn't. So we can do if ages.contains age. And in that case, we don't need to change ages, but we do need to change the corresponding element in students. So we do students.set, and then the index, that's just the index of the current age inside of the ages array list. And then we set it to what this element already is. And then we add a comma, a space, and the name of the current student. And if ages doesn't already contain the current age, then we need to add the current ages, and we need to add the name of the current student to students. And then we use a for loop, iterate through each element of the array lists. So a equals 0 is less than ages.size. You can also do students.size. So you print out ages.get a colon, space, and students.get a. So now to call it in the main class, we do students. We don't need an object because we already have the list of students as the parameter. Now we need to make this method a static method since we did students.printByAge instead of an object.printByAge. So now running this, I already have the input copied, so I'll paste it, and it gives the correct output. So the topics you learned about today were arrays and array lists of objects and for each loops. If you were able to solve part B of the optional exercise, that's great. If not, that's fine. I would encourage you to do some other exercises. You can find them online, and a great place to look would be FRQs of previous AP Computer Science A exams. There will be some problems that you can't do yet because they contain topics such as inheritance, which you haven't learned yet, but there will be some problems that you can already do with the knowledge that you have. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in video number 4.